Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of a very unique lens, the new TTArtisan 75mm F1.5 Swirly Bokeh lens. Now, I've long had a love for vintage glass and have pursued some of lenses like old Helios and Jupiter lenses because they are able of producing that kind of unique swirly effect that can be very desirable, or at least unique if you're into that. The TTArtisan 75mm F1.5 is essentially a new version of the Carl Zeiss Jena Biotar 75mm F1.5, which is a very old lens design in its original form, over 80 years old, and copies of which can cost into the thousands of dollars if you can find them on the used market. Of course, anytime you're going after these old and vintage lenses, I can see looking inside, for example, my Helios 44-2 is that I look inside there, I can see that there is a bit of fungus that's growing inside. There's some mechanical issues. It kind of separates and comes apart a little bit here. That's the nature of these the beast with these. So to be able to get a new lens that has that same optical charm but has a little bit better manufacturing and a whole lot less gunk going on the inside is certainly very interesting, particularly when you can get this lens for only about $270. And it is a lot of fun. However, note that this is going to be a different kind of review of a different kind of lens because pretty much nothing about this lens is conventional. Still sound interesting? Well, let's dive in and let's find out. Today's episode is brought to you by Into the AM, a clothing brand from Southern California that's been a sponsor of this channel for years. They are most famous for their graphic tees and hoodies designed by local artists, and I'm diving into their fall collection like this time warp tee that I'm wearing, and then layering up with their Daybreak performance jacket, which is both water and wind resistant, and I need them both in an Ontario fall. Black Friday is just around the corner, and there are deals up to 60% off. Plus, use the code DUSTIN10 for an additional 10% off. Visit intotheam.com/Dustin10 for more information. So in terms of the basic overall design here, this is essentially shaped like what they called the fat version of the Biotar that was sold from 1952 to 1967. It has, looking at it, a very handsome kind of vintage design to it that frankly really reminds me of a lens like the recent Voigtlander 75mm F1.5 that I reviewed earlier this year. Everything is all metal and glass here, so it does have some heft to it. It weighs about 570 grams or 20 ounces here, and by my measurements it is roughly 73 millimeters in diameter by about 72 millimeters long with a 58 millimeter front filter thread. Now, when you focus towards the closest focus, you're actually going to find that the lens will extend a bit. It will extend out about an additional 10 millimeters. So it is not internally focusing. It's at its longest point when you are focused down to minimum focus. Now, one big thing you're going to have to deal with here is that they have decided to go with the classic M42 mount. And that's not micro 4 seconds. That is the old M42 screw mount that goes back till I think somewhere like the 20s. It's a long-standing mount, but it is quite easy to adapt. But it means you're going to have an adapter. So you can adapt it to a lot of different platforms. Old DSLRs, you can have a thinner kind of adapter, but because here with mirrorless, the optical path needs to be further forward, you'll find that the adapter you're going to need is going to have to be fairly chunky. I've done it on Sony here, and the good news is that the adapters are quite inexpensive. The one I'm using here cost about 20 bucks, and so nothing expensive there, but it is going to add some bulk and some length there and a little bit of price. Now, one thing that I like about the design here is that it actually includes an Allen key with the recognition that as you adapt these, sometimes everything doesn't line up perfectly. You can actually use an Allen key. You can loosen up 3 little screws on here. You can then rotate the lens in its housing to where it's lined up perfectly, then tighten things back down. It's a good, thoughtful touch there, which I appreciate. Now, what's interesting here is that you can actually adapt this to a variety of platforms as mentioned, but that includes in Fujifilm's medium format. And you're actually going to get the most pronounced swirl effect there because more of the image circle is being exposed. It'll also maybe look the softest in some ways there for the same reason. Likewise, if you go to APS-C, you're going to actually crop off a lot of the swirl effect and you're going to retain the more conventional, sharper portion of the image circle. So just be aware of that. Now the manual focus ring here is very nicely implemented. It has that kind of knurled or scalloped feel to it. All metal, everything moves very, very smoothly. Pretty much perfect damping. I really, really like that ring. About 200 degrees of rotation. It's pretty sweet. And so they've done a great job with that. Up front, we have a nicely implemented aperture ring. It has soft clicks throughout, and those clicks will mostly be at the half stops at the earlier part of the range, and then after f5.6, they're only at the full stops. And of course, you have markings just at the full stops along the way. But you can feel those clicks as you go. Inside, we have an aperture iris that's really beautiful. 13 rounded aperture blades, and as you can see here, it looks pretty sweet when you have it stopped down. Minimum focus distance here is 75 millimeters, and it has a fairly low magnification of about 0.10 times, so not incredibly useful. I will point out, however, that there are plenty of adapters like Velo adapter that I have that actually allows you to rotate the adapter itself, and so you can extend that optical path a little bit further forward, which will allow you to get closer focus results. So, just something to bear in mind that for fairly inexpensive, if you want more up close work, you are able to get that. The lens, I will note, is pretty soft when it's at minimum focus distance, just so you know that. Now, obviously here, there are no electronics, there's no weather sealing, there's nothing like that. Now, of course, not everyone is comfortable with manual focus or familiar with it. So let me just take a moment to talk about how this lens works on a Sony camera, which would be very similar to how it would work on a modern mirrorless Canon camera or Nikon camera. It is actually quite easy to manually focus on these platforms. So no, there are no electronics. So that means that you're not going to get, as you start to rotate the ring, you're not going to get an automatic magnification of the focus area. But you can, of course, manually magnify that area, and so you can visually confirm focus quite easy. You can use focus overlays, and so things like focus peaking or a color overlay, you're going to be able to see those things because those are actually handled from within the camera, and they will still work here. You also will be able to use in-body image stabilization if your camera is so equipped. However, you're going to need to manually set the focal length. So in this case, 75 millimeters, and so that the camera body knows how to set the adjustment there. And if you don't, you're going to get some erratic results. So be sure to manually set that focal length for in-body image stabilization. But of course, once you've done those things, I found that focusing I had pretty much perfect accuracy. You just take your time, nail focus, and it's really no issue there. So how about the optics here? As mentioned, this is a completely different kind of lens, and I will give you a deep dive optical breakdown at the end of the video if you're so interested. We have an optical design here, a very old optical design of 6 elements in 4 groups. Very simple. 2 of those are high index elements. The MTF chart, if you're just looking at MTF charts, looks pretty scary. And of course, part of that is by design. It actually is designed around having some optical flaws, and that's part of the overall charm and look. That swirly effect that people are going to buy this lens for is actually the result of optical defects, which is why the MTF chart doesn't look all that fantastic. Now, in some metrics, the lens does quite well. I found that it has very low distortion, a tiny bit of barrel distortion that is negligible to fix. I used a +3. It has quite a minimal amount of vignette. I used only a +45, which is well under 2 stops, so no major issue there. I also found that there was basically no lateral chromatic aberrations. However, you will definitely see some longitudinal style fringing, particularly in high contrast situations. So you will see some fringing, but above all, what you're going to get is very low contrast. This at f1.5, it very much has that dreamy rendering, as we euphemistically call it, a low amount of contrast. So there is enough pop in the center of the frame that you can get a credible result that we'll talk more about in just a moment. So wide open at f1.5, low contrast in the center, but a decent amount of detail. Very quickly, however, as you go towards the mid frame, you can see resolution drops, and by the time you get to the corners, forget about it. It is very, very soft there. The center will start to really sharpen up, and in contrast will improve by f2. The corners are going to still be very soft, and they don't get reasonably sharp. They never get exceptionally sharp, but they don't get reasonably sharp until about f5.6. So f5.6, f8 are decent apertures if you want to shoot more conventional landscape style images where just about everything is in focus. And of course, as per usual, diffraction is going to hit. I'm using a high resolution 61 megapixel A7R Mark V for this. And so by f11, most lenses are looking softer. And then at minimum aperture, in this case, f16, you can really see the effects of diffraction, and it's very much softer still. Now, actually, the nature of that swirl effect, it's not always going to be present. One of the cool things about this lens is you really can create a variety of different looks. And so if you get close to your subject, you can actually just have quite a soft and creamy background. As you can see from this shot, when you have strong blurred background, it's just really, really soft. Where you start to get that swirl effect is actually a little bit further out. It's typically in the 2 to 3 meter range that it is the most pronounced. And you can see as I pull back and forth here through manual focus that it kind of comes and goes. And there is a zone there where it is very strongly pronounced. For that reason, you're probably going to want to compose with your subject in the center of the frame. For one thing, that allows you to get a little bit more 3D separation, so your subject will be sharper. And then also, it works best when you can put things on either side of them to create the swirl effect. And so obviously, it's also going to work best if you have something that is close to that area, that plane of focus, that you can defocus to create the most desirable look. So for the most part, this is a fairly conventional lens after f2, just not a super sharp one. But from f1.5 to f2, it's quite interesting in the looks that you can create. Now, when the sun's in the frame, it will do a few different things. If you're stopped down, you'll mostly get lower contrast, some veiling effect, as you can see from this landscape shot. But then also, if you're shooting at larger aperture, you're going to get some other kind of ghosting type artifacts. None of them are actually terribly destructive, and some of them can be used artistically. And actually, I would say that this is an area where this lens works better than what some of the older lenses do. I wouldn't say it's got full-blown modern coatings, but it does seem to be a little bit better in that regard. Maybe it helps that it's not full of fungus and other things that I tend to have to deal with some of the vintage glass. The color from the lens is mostly good. I do find that sometimes it's less desirable in high contrast situations at large apertures. It tends to wash out a bit, and you can see that there's quite a difference in the color from a large aperture shot to a smaller aperture shot in this comparison here. So overall, I mean, lots of optical flaws, but a lot of very interesting character to the lens, which is obviously going to be the whole reason why it is desirable. So my conclusion is this. This is obviously a quirky lens that is not conventional in any way, using an old mount and an old optical design, but it can be a blast if you're tired of sterile, overcorrected modern lenses and you want something with some vintage charm. It's got that in abundance. And of course, when you compare it to the Biotar lens that it emulates, it is an incredible value. That Biotar lens is going to cost you probably 10 times as much as this. There's a good chance it won't be nearly as in good a shape either. Of course, it will be a much better collector's item and might be worth even more in the future. That's the luck of the draw. But if you don't want to spend huge money on an old-fashioned lens, well, then you can spend a fairly minimal amount of money for a brand new lens. If you want more information, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. And of course, right after this, we're going to dive into a closer look at the optical performance. Stay tuned. So starting with a look at vignette and distortion, you can see a very mild bulge due to some barrel distortion. Not very hard to correct at all. It's nice and linear. A +3 took care of all of that. You'll also see a bit of vignette in the corners. You can see, again, that cleared up very nicely. That's a +45 dialed in there. So in general, the challenge for this lens is going to be overall just the contrast and detail. So you can see here that part of that is some chromatic aberrations. You can see that there's just a general glow, kind of that dreamy look to everything, but then also there is some green fringing. You can see out of the plane of focus, and out here you can see a little bit of magenta fringing. That will really kind of vary. Now, obviously, this is a less high contrast scene, and so, I mean, the corners are still soft, as we're going to see. But as we take a look at the chromy surfaces here, you can see there is a little bit of fringing, a little bit around the windows, but it's also not like huge and very strongly pronounced. And I would say that in general, the contrast looks a little bit better as well. And of course, looking out the window is what it's all about, getting that swirly look out there. Here's another shot where this is stopped down a little bit. This is about f1.8. And you can see that, again, as we get towards the edge of the frame, that there's a loss of contrast. But again, in this lower contrast scene, The detail there is actually quite good, you can see, and neither am I seeing a lot of fringing on any of these shiny surfaces inside here. Mostly just as you get towards the edge of the frame, you can see that the image starts to soften. Now, what we don't see is a lot of lateral chromatic aberrations. And here near the edge of the frame, it's actually really clean transitions from black to white, so no issues there. Now, I wanted to show this image just for a moment to let you know that I ran into this while I was metering for my chart test, and that is that at smaller apertures, you may or may not always get consistent metering. And so you might just want to make sure if you need to kind of bias exposure one direction or another, it's most likely going to be adding some exposure, because as you can see here, as I got towards the smaller apertures, the camera tended to meter wrong with this lens, and it was underexposing by pretty much a full stop, maybe even a hair more, as you can see here. Now we'll take a look at resolution and sharpness. This is on a 61 megapixel Sony A7R Mark V. And so you can see, even looking at it as a whole, you're going to see a real loss of contrast. There's quite a difference between here and here as far as even just the general contrast. If we punch into this 200% magnification, there's actually a pretty good detail that's there. If you were to able to remove the low contrast, kind of that Vaseline smear over the top of things, there's actually quite a good amount of detail here in the center of the frame. As we move towards the mid frame, however, already that's starting to fade, and as we go down, we can see that again here there's quite a difference between the contrast here and then here. By the time you get to the corners, again, it's not that there's no resolution, it's that there is very, very little contrast. If we take that out into a real world shot, you can see the effect here, and so in the center of the frame at f1.5, really not too bad. You can see right here in a little zone, there's good detail and contrast, but very quickly you can see how that all of that contrast fades away, and as we get towards the edge, you very much have that dreamy effect, which is part of the general look that this lens exhibits. So if you can use that well, and that's with composing with your subject in the center of the frame, really pretty good there in terms of detail and contrast on my wife's face. You can see already by the time you get to her hands that it's starting to fade, and then there's kind of a general glow everywhere else. But it allows the look here to where there is a three-dimensional pop, because everything else looks quite soft by comparison. So interestingly, by the time you stop down even to f2, you can see by looking at the image as a whole, it's already starting to change. Just everything is starting to look brighter. And so in the center of the frame, it's like that smear has been taken off, and now you're able to see the detail and the contrast. So at f2, really sharp center of the frame, but you can see that even though it's better, you're extending that zone of sharpness out, it's still going to drop off. And so as we see down here, it's better, but you can see it's still quite kind of dreamy and glowy in that corner. And as you get down towards the edge, it's basically like everything is still in a fog. It's just like the sun is starting to come out and the fog is brighter looking. At f2.8 and then at f4, we can see that the corners really haven't gotten sharper. The contrast is starting to improve, but it's not quite there yet. Going back to the center of the frame, and it's super sharp in the center of the frame. Take a look over here at the mid frame. By f4, you can see that the mid frame is looking really crisp. If we throw f5.6 in the mix now, you can see that that looks even sharper still. And if we pop down into the corners, you can see that the corner is now starting to look acceptably sharp, though certainly not exceptionally sharp. Things are just a little bit better by f8, but you can see it's still not really completely crisp, although this zone here is starting to look quite good. Popping over here, we can see that this section out to here, it is really, really sharp. And as we look towards the edge, yeah, it really looks quite good here. It's only when you get right towards the outer edge where things start to soften up. So after f8, by f11, the image will be just very slightly softer due to diffraction, and then you can see by f16, which is there on the right, the image is softening up significantly. Now, if we take a look at the up-close performance, here's our minimum focus distance shot, and you can see, as we'd kind of expect, there's not a lot of contrast there. You're really going to need to stop down a bit if you want better contrast and detail. And of course, as you get further out, you start to get that blooming effect elsewhere. So the nature of the bokeh really is going to vary upon where you compose your image. So for example, in this shot, which I quite like, you can see that detail is not out of this world, but you can see there's a reasonable amount of detail that's there, but the background is really, really creamy. It's just blurred away really beautifully. In this shot here, we've got the swirl effect, and so this is about in the right zone. So I focused out about 2 to 3 meters, and in that zone, you can see you get that really pronounced kind of circular swirl shape that is kind of the desirable quality. Here's another shot here, and again, composing where you can get your subject as much towards the center as possible, because remember, there's a pretty tiny sweet spot of sharpness. So if you can get your subject there, and then you have things around for you to kind of swirl with, you can really create some really beautiful images. So here you can see from this particular shot where I just stood here and I just focused along. So with a complete defocus, you can see just how soft and creamy you can get the bokeh. Now, as we start to move towards that zone, you can see the swirling effect starting to take place. If I focus past that zone, however, you can see that in the foreground, you really don't get the swirl effect. You mostly just get a low contrast type look. So I wouldn't say that foreground bokeh is nearly as desirable. It's going to be more that background swirl that is going to kind of be the sweet spot for this. So here you can see a little bit more of a conventional shot at this distance, a little bit closer. There is a little bit of swirl effect, but mostly it's just a blurred out background, although the quality of the blur is really nice. If I step back just a little bit further, you can see how much more of that swirl effect begins to take place. Now again, taking a look at flare resistance here, you can see with the sun right out of the frame and shooting at a large aperture, we get this overall kind of ghosting pattern here. I mean, again, I think that most people would find that generally tasteful and useful in certain situations. I didn't love it as much stopped down in this shot, where basically you just end up losing contrast on the image. And so it looks like there's a dust storm that's blowing through or something. Not nearly as desirable in my opinion. This shot I really like. And so here we do have some of that prismatic haze and a little of that effect we saw on a former image. But even though contrast and detail isn't great, there's kind of just a general glow to the image that's really quite nice. Now, if you're not shooting into the sun and you stop the lens down, you can get nice color and detail, and you can see in this shot that I was able to get detail pretty much all throughout the frame. And so this is, I believe, around f6.3 or f8, and you can see that that looks just like a conventionally beautiful shot. Great detail, great contrast, great color. This is a lens that has a lot of different types of personality, and so I think that if you learn to use it to its strengths, you can really achieve a lot of different looks. So thanks for sticking around to the end, and hopefully a deep dive into the optical performance has let you know whether or not this TTArtisan 75mm F1.5 Swirly Bokeh lens is the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.